Camp Shelby, Mississippi. August 1944. Captain James Nakamura stood outside the barracks of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, watching men who looked like him prepare for a war against people who looked like him. The heat in Mississippi was different from the heat in California. It was thick, wet, suffocating. It made the air feel solid. Nakamura had been at Camp Shelby for 14 months of training Nisei soldiers, second-generation Japanese Americans, to fight for a country that had imprisoned their families. 14 months of saluting white officers who looked at him with something between respect and suspicion. 14 months of proving, over and over, that loyalty could be measured. The 442nd was different from other units. Every man here had volunteered from behind barbed wire. From Manzanar. From Hart Mountain. From Tule Lake. They had signed up to fight while their parents lived in tar paper barracks in the desert, guarded by soldiers with rifles pointed inward. Nakamura understood why they volunteered. He had done the same thing. Before the war, he had been a schoolteacher in Los Angeles. He taught history to children whose parents ran produce stores and flower shops. He taught them about the Constitution, about democracy, about what it meant to be American. Then came December 7, 1941. Executive Order 9066 followed 4 months later. Nakamura remembered the day the notices appeared. Instructions printed on white paper, taped to telephone poles. Report to the assembly center. Bring only what you can carry. Do not ask questions. He had watched his neighbors pack their lives into suitcases. He had watched the Tanaka family sell their grocery store for $300, a store they had built over 20 years. He had watched Mrs. Yoshida burn her Japanese books in the backyard, terrified that owning them would make things worse. But Nakamura hadn't gone to the camps. He had received a different letter. An invitation. The army needed Japanese language instructors. Men who could teach white soldiers to understand the enemy. Men who could prove their loyalty by helping America win. Nakamura had accepted. He told himself it was the right choice. That teaching intelligence officers to read Japanese documents would save American lives. That serving in uniform would prove something important. But he knew what people said. He had heard the whispers. He saved himself. He left his people behind. He chose the easy path. Now, in August 1944, Nakamura commanded a training company at Camp Shelby. He trained men who had made the opposite choice. Men who had volunteered from the camps, who wore the uniform while their families remained imprisoned. They respected him. But they also watched him. Because Nakamura carried something they didn't, the weight of having been free while they were not. The 442nd had been in training for over a year. They trained harder than any unit Nakamura had ever seen. They ran obstacle courses in full gear under the Mississippi sun. They practiced marksmanship until their hands bled. They memorized field manuals and tactical procedures with an intensity that went beyond discipline. They were trying to prove something. Every single one of them. Nakamura watched them and saw himself. His own proving had started long before Camp Shelby. It had started the moment he accepted the Army's offer in 1942. It had continued through every language class he taught, every report he translated, every interaction with white officers who wanted to believe he was loyal but couldn't quite manage it. In the spring of 1943, Nakamura had been assigned to a military intelligence unit in San Francisco. His job was to translate captured Japanese documents, letters from soldiers, operational orders, supply manifests. Mundane work. Necessary work. But also work that required him to read the words of men who believed they were fighting for their emperor, for their families, for their honor. Nakamura read those letters late into the night. Letters from Japanese soldiers to their mothers. To their wives. Letters that spoke of duty and sacrifice in the hope that their deaths would mean something. He translated every word with clinical precision. He handed the translations to intelligence officers who used them to plan operations that would kill the men who had written them. He told himself this was loyalty. But sometimes, alone in his quarters, he wondered if it was something else. Something closer to betrayal. The breaking point had come in December 1943. Nakamura had been translating a batch of documents recovered from Tarawa. One of them was a personal diary, written by a Japanese lieutenant named Suzuki. The diary covered 3 months of the war, from October to December 1943. Suzuki wrote about his family in Hiroshima. About his daughter's 5th birthday, which he had missed. About the cherry trees near his home that would bloom in the spring, and how he hoped to see them again. He wrote about duty. About the burden of command. About the men under his care, and how he prayed he would lead them well. The final entry was dated December 18, 1943. 2 days before the American assault on Tarawa. Tomorrow we will face the enemy. I do not know if I will survive. But I know that I must do my duty. For my family. For my men. For Japan. Nakamura had sat at his desk, holding the diary, and felt something crack inside him. Suzuki had died at Tarawa. Nakamura knew that because the diary had been recovered from his body. Suzuki had died doing his duty. Just as Nakamura was doing his. 2 men. Same values. Same sense of honor. Different flags. Nakamura had finished the translation. He had filed the report. He had said nothing. But the question remained, what does loyalty mean when both sides believe they are right? Now, at Camp Shelby, Nakamura faced a different kind of test. The 442nd was almost ready for deployment. In a few months, they would ship out to Europe. They would fight. They would bleed. They would prove their loyalty in the only way America seemed to accept, by dying for it. Nakamura's role was to prepare them. To make sure they understood combat tactics, field communications, the basics of survival in a war zone. But there was another part of his job. A part that wasn't written in any manual. Colonel Harris, the regimental commander, had made it clear during Nakamura's first week at Camp Shelby. These men are loyal, Harris had said. I believe that. But there are people in Washington who don't. Your job, Captain, is to make sure nothing happens that gives those people ammunition. Sir? Nakamura had asked, though he already understood. Watch them. Listen to them. If any man expresses doubt about the mission, about the country, about the war, I need to know. Immediately. Nakamura had nodded. Understood, sir. Harris had smiled. I knew I could count on you, Captain. You understand what's at stake here. For all of you. Nakamura had left that meeting with a sick feeling in his stomach. He was being asked to spy on his own men. To listen for disloyalty. To report anyone who questioned whether it was fair to fight for a country that had imprisoned their families. For months, Nakamura had done exactly that. He listened. He watched. He filed reports. Most of the men were fiercely loyal. They spoke about proving themselves. About honor. About showing America that Japanese Americans could be trusted. But some expressed doubt. Private Takeshi Yamamoto, who had volunteered from Manzanar, had said during a late-night conversation, "My father is 70 years old. He's in a camp in the desert because the government thinks he's dangerous. How is that American?" Nakamura had reported it. Corporal Henry Fujimoto, whose family had lost their farm in California, had said, "We're fighting for freedom in Europe while our families live behind barbed wire." Does anyone else see the irony? Nakamura had reported it. Sergeant Robert Tanaka, one of the best soldiers in the company, had said quietly one evening, "Sometimes I wonder if we're just trying to prove something that can't be proved. That we're American enough. As if there's a level of loyalty that will finally be enough." Nakamura had reported it. Each time, he told himself he was doing his duty. Protecting the unit. Ensuring that nothing jeopardized the 442 ND's deployment. Each time, he felt the weight of it settle deeper into his chest. The men never knew. Nakamura was careful. He never asked direct questions. He never pushed. He just listened, and remembered, and wrote reports that disappeared into Colonel Harris's office. But Sergeant Tanaka had started looking at him differently. As if he suspected something. Nakamura told himself he was imagining it. August 14, 1944. Nakamura was in his office, reviewing training schedules, when Colonel Harris summoned him. The colonel's office was in the administration building, a wooden structure that offered air conditioning, a luxury reserved for senior officers. Nakamura entered and saluted. "At ease, Captain." Harris gestured to a chair. "Sit." Nakamura sat. Harris leaned back in his chair, studying Nakamura with an expression that was difficult to read. Not hostile. Not friendly. Evaluating. "The 442nd ships out in 6 weeks, Harris said. "You've done good work preparing them." "Thank you, sir. But there's a problem." Nakamura felt his stomach tighten. "Sir?" Harris slid a folder across the desk. "Read this." Nakamura opened the folder. Inside was a typed report, stamped confidential. The report detailed allegations of subversive activity within the 442nd. It cited conversations that expressed doubt about the American mission and sympathy for enemy nationals. It recommended that certain individuals be removed from the unit before deployment. Nakamura read the names listed in the report. Private Yamamoto, Corporal Fujimoto, Sergeant Tanaka, and 6 others. 9 men total. All of them soldiers Nakamura had personally reported on. He looked up. "Sir, these men are loyal. They volunteered from the camps. They've trained harder than anyone." "I know," Harris interrupted. "And I agree with you. But this didn't come from me." "Then where?" "Military intelligence. They've been reviewing your reports. They've decided that these 9 men present a security risk." Nakamura felt cold. "My reports were meant to provide context. Not to." "I understand, Captain. But intelligence has made its decision. These men are to be transferred out of the 442nd and reassigned to labor battalions. Effective immediately." Nakamura stared at the folder. Labor battalions. Non-combat. The kind of assignments given to men the Army didn't trust. These men had volunteered to fight. They had endured months of brutal training. They had proven themselves over and over. And now they would be removed because of conversations Nakamura had reported. "Sir," Nakamura said carefully, "I believe this is a mistake." Harris sighed. "So do I. But the order comes from above my head." "Above yours." "It's happening." Nakamura's hands clenched the folder. "These men deserve better." "Maybe. But that's not how the Army works. You know that." Harris leaned forward. "Here's the situation, Captain. Intelligence wants these transfers processed quietly. No explanations. No appeals. The men will be told they're being reassigned for administrative reasons. They'll leave Camp Shelby in 72 hours. And my role? You're going to deliver the orders." Nakamura looked up sharply. "Sir? You're their commanding officer. It's your responsibility." "Colonel, with respect, I." "This isn't a request, Captain. It's an order." The room went silent. Nakamura sat there, holding the folder, feeling the weight of what was being asked of him. He had reported these men. He had provided the information that led to this decision. And now he had to look them in the eye and tell them they were being removed from the unit they had sacrificed everything to join. "Sir," Nakamura said quietly, "this is wrong." Harris's expression didn't change. "Probably. But it's happening anyway. I could refuse." "You could. And then you'd be court-martialed for insubordination. And someone else would deliver the orders. The outcome would be the same, except you'd be destroyed in the process." Nakamura said nothing. Harris stood. You have 72 hours, Captain. I suggest you use them wisely. Nakamura saluted and left the office. He walked across the base in the afternoon heat, the folder tucked under his arm. Around him, soldiers drilled and trained and prepared for a war they believed would prove their worth. Nakamura knew the truth now. No amount of proof would ever be enough. August 15, 1944. Evening. Nakamura stood outside the barracks where Sergeant Robert Tanaka slept. He had spent the entire day trying to find another way. He had reviewed regulations. He had considered filing an appeal. He had even drafted a letter to the Inspector General's office. But every path led to the same conclusion: the order would be carried out. The only question was whether Nakamura would be the one to do it. He could refuse. He could resign his commission. He could take a stand and accept the consequences. But what would that accomplish? The 9 men would still be transferred. And Nakamura would be destroyed, his own loyalty permanently questioned. He had spent 14 months proving himself. 14 months of service, of sacrifice, of doing everything the army asked. If he refused now, it would all mean nothing. Nakamura pushed open the barracks door. Inside, soldiers sat on bunks, writing letters, cleaning equipment, talking quietly. The conversation stopped when Nakamura entered. Men stood at attention. "At ease," Nakamura said. His voice sounded hollow. He scanned the room and found Tanaka sitting near the back, polishing his boots. "Sergeant Tanaka." "A word." Tanaka stood and followed Nakamura outside. They walked in silence to the edge of the parade ground, away from the barracks, away from the noise. Finally, Nakamura stopped and turned to face him. Tanaka waited. His expression was calm, but his eyes held something else. Knowledge, maybe. Or suspicion. "Sergeant," Nakamura began, and then stopped. The words wouldn't come. He looked at Tanaka, a man who had volunteered from Heart Mountain, who had trained for a year, who had never complained, who believed that fighting for America would mean something. And Nakamura was about to destroy that belief. "You're being transferred," Nakamura said finally. "You and 8 others. Effective in 72 hours. Tanaka's expression didn't change. "Where?" "A labor battalion. In Louisiana. Non-combat." "Yes." Tanaka was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Why?" Nakamura had prepared an answer. "Administrative reasons. Organizational needs." The standard bureaucratic language. But standing there, facing Tanaka, he couldn't say it. "Because someone decided you're a security risk," Nakamura said quietly. Tanaka's jaw tightened. "Based on what?" Nakamura said nothing. And in that silence, Tanaka understood. "You reported me." It wasn't a question. Nakamura felt something break inside him. "I was following orders." "You were listening," Tanaka said. His voice was low, controlled. "You were watching. And you reported us. I didn't know this would happen. But it did. And now I'm being sent to a labor battalion because I said what we're all thinking. That maybe, just maybe, this country doesn't trust us no matter what we do." Nakamura wanted to defend himself. To explain. To make Tanaka understand that he had been trying to protect the unit, that he had no choice, that loyalty required hard decisions. But the words died in his throat. Because Tanaka was right. "I'm sorry," Nakamura said. Tanaka looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "No, you're not. You're just doing your duty." He turned and walked back toward the barracks. Nakamura stood alone on the parade ground as the sun set over Camp Shelby. He had followed orders. He had done his duty. He had proven his loyalty. And in doing so, he had betrayed the men who trusted him. August 18, 1944. Morning. The 9 men left Camp Shelby before dawn. Nakamura watched from his office window as they boarded the trucks that would take them to the train station. They carried their duffel bags. They wore their uniforms. They did not speak. Sergeant Tanaka was the last to board. He paused at the truck's tailgate and looked back toward the administration building. Nakamura stepped away from the window. When he looked again, the trucks were gone. Colonel Harris entered the office an hour later. "It's done?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "Good. Intelligence is satisfied. The deployment will proceed as planned." "Yes, sir." Harris studied Nakamura. "You did the right thing, Captain." Nakamura said nothing. "The 442nd is going to be one of the most decorated units in the Army," Harris continued. "Because of the work you did here. Because you made sure nothing jeopardized their mission." "Yes, sir." Harris left. Nakamura sat at his desk and opened his drawer. Inside was a stack of reports. Months of observations. Conversations overheard. Doubts expressed. All of it written in his own hand. He had followed orders. He had done his duty. He had proven that a Japanese-American officer could be trusted to make the hard decisions. But as he sat there, alone in his office, Nakamura understood something with absolute certainty. Loyalty, when measured by betrayal, was not loyalty at all. It was just obedience. And obedience had a cost that could never be paid back. Camp Shelby, Mississippi. September 1944. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team deployed to Europe 3 weeks after the 9 men were transferred. Captain James Nakamura did not go with them. He had expected to. He had trained with the unit for 14 months. He had prepared them for combat. He had done everything the Army asked. But 2 days before deployment, Colonel Harris had called him into his office. "Change of orders, Captain. You're staying stateside." Nakamura had felt the words like a physical blow. "Sir? Military intelligence has requested you for a special assignment. You'll be briefed tomorrow. But the 442nd will deploy without you. You've done your job here. They're ready." Harris had smiled. "Consider this a promotion, Captain. Intelligence doesn't request officers unless they see value." Nakamura had saluted and left. That night, he had stood outside the barracks and watched the men of the 442nd pack their gear. They moved with purpose, with determination. They were finally going to war. Finally going to prove themselves. None of them looked at Nakamura. Word had spread about the 9 men. Not the details, those remained classified, but enough. The soldiers knew that men had been removed. They knew it had happened quietly, without explanation. And they knew that Captain Nakamura had been involved. The trust was gone. Nakamura told himself it didn't matter. He had followed orders. He had done his duty. The 442nd would go to Europe and fight with honor, and that was what mattered. But as he watched them prepare to leave, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. Shame. The special assignment came with new orders: report to Fort Meade, Maryland. Military Intelligence Service. Immediate transfer. Nakamura arrived at Fort Meade in late September. The base was different from Camp Shelby. Smaller. Quieter. The kind of place where wars were planned, not fought. He was assigned to a unit called the Pacific Intelligence Section. His commanding officer was a lieutenant colonel named William Breckinridge, a career intelligence officer who had spent years in the Philippines before the war. Breckinridge was in his early 50s, thin, with sharp eyes that seemed to evaluate everything. He greeted Nakamura in an office filled with maps of the Pacific Theater. "Captain Nakamura. I've read your file. Impressive work at Camp Shelby." "Thank you, sir. You understand the Japanese mind. You speak the language. You know how they think." Breckinridge leaned forward. "That's why you're here." He gestured to the maps. "The war in the Pacific is entering a critical phase. We're pushing toward the Japanese home islands. Every step forward costs lives. American lives. Nakamura nodded. Our job, Breckinridge continued, is to minimize those costs. To gather intelligence that saves soldiers. To understand the enemy so well that we can predict their moves before they make them. I understand, sir. Breckinridge studied him. Do you, Captain? Because what I'm about to ask you to do will test that understanding. He opened a folder and slid a photograph across the desk. The photograph showed a Japanese man in civilian clothes, maybe 40 years old, standing in front of a building Nakamura didn't recognize. His name is Hiroshi Takeda, Breckinridge said. He's a Japanese national who immigrated to the United States in 1935. Before the war, he worked as a trade liaison in San Francisco, importing goods from Japan. Legitimate business. And now he's in a detention facility in New Mexico. He was arrested in December 1941 under the Alien Enemies Act. He's been there for almost 3 years. Nakamura looked at the photograph. Takeda's expression was neutral, unreadable. Why am I looking at this? Nakamura asked. Breckinridge smiled. Because Takeda has information we need. And you're going to get it from him. The detention facility in New Mexico was not like the internment camps. The camps held families. American citizens of Japanese descent. People who had committed no crime except being born with the wrong ancestry. The detention facilities held different people. Japanese nationals. Men the government considered dangerous. Businessmen with connections to Japan. Community leaders. Buddhist priests. Anyone who might have divided loyalties. Takeda had been held at the Santa Fe facility since early 1942. According to his file, he had been cooperative but reserved. He answered questions. He followed rules. He gave nothing away. Military intelligence believed he knew more than he was saying. Breckinridge had explained it during Nakamura's briefing. Takeda worked in trade. He had contacts throughout Japan. Shipping companies. Manufacturing firms. Government officials. Before the war, that was legal. Now, it's valuable. What kind of information are we looking for? Nakamura had asked. Anything that helps us understand Japanese logistics. Supply chains. Industrial capacity. How they're sustaining the war effort despite our blockade. And you think Takeda knows this? We think he knows people who know. And we think he can be persuaded to share. Nakamura had felt uneasy. Persuaded how? Breckinridge had looked at him carefully. That's where you come in, Captain. Takeda has been interrogated by white officers for 3 years. He tells them nothing useful. But you. He paused. You're different. You speak his language. You understand his culture. You can build trust. Trust, Nakamura had repeated. Yes. Make him believe you're sympathetic. That you understand his situation. That you're on his side. And then you extract the information we need. Nakamura had understood immediately what was being asked. He was being ordered to deceive. To manipulate. To betray trust in order to serve American intelligence. It was Camp Shelby all over again. Except this time, the target wasn't soldiers under his command. It was a man who had already lost everything. Nakamura arrived at the Santa Fe facility in early October. The facility was surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Inside, men lived in barracks similar to the internment camps, but the atmosphere was different. Heavier. These men knew they were considered enemies. Nakamura was given an office in the administration building. Small. Bare. A desk, 2 chairs, a window that looked out at the desert. He spent the first week reviewing Takeda's file. Hiroshi Takeda had come to America in 1935 with his wife and young daughter. He had built a successful import business in San Francisco. He had been active in the Japanese community, not politically, but socially. He attended cultural events. He donated to community organizations. He had been arrested on December 8, 1941. One day after Pearl Harbor. His wife and daughter had been sent to Topaz internment camp in Utah. Takeda had been classified as a security risk and sent to detention. For 3 years, he had been separated from his family. The file included transcripts of previous interrogations. Pages and pages of questions and answers. Question: do you have contacts in the Japanese government? I worked in trade. I knew people in the Ministry of Commerce. That was my job. Question: did you provide information to Japan before the war? I provided business reports. Market analysis. Nothing secret. Question: do you still have contacts in Japan? The war has been going on for 3 years. I have been here for 3 years. I have no contacts. The interrogators had pressed. They had threatened. They had offered deals. Takeda had given them nothing. Nakamura closed the file and stared out the window at the desert. He understood why Breckinridge had chosen him for this assignment. A white officer interrogating Takeda was an enemy extracting information. But Nakamura, a Japanese American in uniform, could be something else. He could be a bridge. A fellow victim of circumstance. Someone who understood. It was a lie, of course. But it was a lie that might work. The first meeting with Takeda took place on October 12. Nakamura sat in the small office and waited. A guard brought Takeda in and left them alone. Takeda was smaller than Nakamura had expected. Thin. Graying hair. He wore civilian clothes that had seen better days. His expression was calm, but his eyes held the weariness of a man who had endured 3 years of captivity. He sat in the chair across from Nakamura and waited. Nakamura spoke in Japanese. My name is Captain James Nakamura. I'm with military intelligence. Takeda nodded but said nothing. I know you've been through many interrogations, Nakamura continued. I'm not here to repeat them. I'm here to talk. About what? Takeda's voice was quiet, measured. About your situation. About your family. About what happens next. Takeda's expression didn't change. I have answered every question I've been asked. I have nothing more to say. I understand. But I'm not asking you to say anything. Not yet. I just want to talk. Takeda studied him. Your Nisei? Yes. Your family? Manzanar. Takeda nodded slowly. And yet you wear the uniform? Yes. Why? It was a simple question. But it carried weight. Nakamura could have given the official answer. Duty. Loyalty. Service. But sitting across from Takeda, he found himself saying something else. Because I wanted to prove I belonged. Takeda's eyes flickered with something, recognition, maybe. Or pity. And have you, he asked. Proved it? Nakamura didn't answer. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Takeda said, What do you want from me, Captain? Information. About your contacts in Japan. About supply networks. About anything that might help end this war. I have no such information. Maybe. But you have knowledge. Experience. You understand how Japanese business works. How logistics function. That knowledge could save American lives. Takeda leaned back in his chair. And if I provide this knowledge, what happens to me? That depends. On what? On how useful the information is. Takeda smiled, but there was no warmth in it. So I trade what I know for the possibility of freedom. Is that the offer? It's an opportunity. No, Captain. It's coercion. Dressed in polite language, but coercion nonetheless. Nakamura said nothing. Takeda stood. I have been in this facility for 3 years. I have been separated from my wife and daughter for 3 years. I have lost my business, my home, my life. And now you come here, wearing a uniform, speaking my language, and ask me to betray the country of my birth so that I might earn the right to be treated like a human being." He looked at Nakamura with something close to contempt. "You want to prove you belong, Captain? Then understand this, no amount of service will ever be enough. Because the question is not whether you are loyal. The question is whether they will ever believe you are." He walked to the door and knocked. The guard opened it, and Takeda left without another word. Nakamura sat alone in the office, feeling the weight of Takeda's words settle over him. Nakamura met with Takeda 12 more times over the next 6 weeks. Each meeting followed the same pattern. Nakamura would ask questions. Takeda would deflect. They would talk around the subject, circling but never landing. But slowly, something changed. Takeda began to talk about his life before the war. About his business. About the people he had worked with. Not names, never names, but details. The way Japanese shipping companies operated. The relationships between manufacturers and distributors. The informal networks that made trade possible. It wasn't intelligence. Not yet. But it was information. Nakamura reported everything to Breckinridge. "You're making progress," Breckinridge said during one of their weekly briefings. "Keep pushing. He's not going to give us names, sir. Then get us patterns. Get us structures. Anything we can use to understand how they're moving supplies." Nakamura returned to the facility and continued the meetings. By late November, Takeda was speaking more freely. He talked about the logistics of moving goods from Japan to occupied territories. About the challenges of maintaining supply lines across vast distances. About the vulnerabilities in the system. He never explicitly said, "This is how you can disrupt Japanese logistics." But the implications were clear. Nakamura wrote detailed reports. He passed them to Breckinridge. The information was analyzed, cross-referenced with other intelligence, and used to plan operations. And with each report, Nakamura felt the weight of what he was doing. He was building trust with Takeda. Real trust. The kind that came from shared language, shared culture, shared understanding. And he was using that trust to extract information that would be used against Japan. It was his job. It was his duty. But it felt like betrayal. December 1, 1944. Nakamura arrived at the facility for his scheduled meeting with Takeda. But when he entered the office, Takeda's expression was different. Harder. Closed. "What's wrong?" Nakamura asked. Takeda didn't answer immediately. He sat in the chair, his hands folded in his lap, and stared at the floor. Finally, he said, "I received a letter from my wife yesterday." Nakamura waited. "She is ill. Pneumonia. The camp doctor says she needs better care, but there is no better care. Not in the camps." Takeda looked up. His eyes were red. "My daughter is 12 years old. She is taking care of her mother because there is no one else." Nakamura felt his chest tighten. "I'm sorry. Are you?" Takeda's voice was sharp. "Or are you just saying what you think I need to hear?" "I mean it." "Then help me." "How?" "Get me out of here. Let me go to my family. Let me take care of my wife." Nakamura hesitated. "I don't have that authority. But you know people who do. You're military intelligence. You have connections. You could make this happen. It's not that simple." "Yes, it is." Takeda leaned forward. "You want information. I've given you information. Now I want something in return. Get me to my family." Nakamura felt trapped. "I'll talk to my commanding officer." "No. You'll do more than talk. You'll make it happen. Because if you don't, I'm done. No more meetings. No more information. Nothing." Takeda stood and walked to the door. He knocked, and the guard opened it. Before leaving, Takeda looked back at Nakamura. You asked me once why I wouldn't help. Now you know. Because help only flows one direction in this war. And it's never toward people like us. The door closed. Nakamura sat alone in the office, his mind racing. He reported the conversation to Breckinridge that evening. Can we transfer him to Topaz? Nakamura asked. Let him be with his family? Breckinridge shook his head. He's classified as a security detainee. Different rules. He can't be moved to an internment camp. Then release him. Not possible. Not without approval from Washington. And that could take months. His wife is dying. I understand that, Captain. But our priority is intelligence, not compassion. Nakamura felt anger rising. He's given us valuable information. Doesn't that earn him anything? It earns him consideration. But not release. Not yet. Breckinridge leaned back in his chair. Here's what I can do. I can expedite a review of his case. If he continues to cooperate, I can recommend a transfer to a lower security facility. One that allows family visits. How long will that take? 6 months. Maybe less. 6 months, Nakamura repeated. His wife might not have 6 months. Then he'll have to hope she does. Breckinridge's tone was final. Get back to work, Captain. We need more information. And Takeda is our best source. December 8, 1944. Nakamura sat in the office, waiting for Takeda. He had spent the past week trying to find another way. He had reviewed regulations. He had contacted other officers. He had even considered writing directly to the War Department. But every path led to the same conclusion: Takeda would not be released. Not soon enough to matter. Nakamura had a choice. He could tell Takeda the truth. That the army wouldn't help. That the information he had provided wasn't enough to earn his freedom. Or he could lie. He could tell Takeda that his case was being reviewed. That there was hope. That if he continued to cooperate, he might see his family again. It was the same choice he had faced at Camp Shelby. Tell the truth and lose the asset. Or lie and keep extracting information. The door opened. Takeda entered. He looked older than he had a week ago. The news about his wife had taken something from him. He sat down and looked at Nakamura. Waiting. Nakamura took a breath. I spoke to my commanding officer, he began. He's reviewing your case. Takeda's expression didn't change. And? He can't release you. Not immediately. But he can recommend a transfer to a facility that allows family visits. It will take time, but... How much time? Nakamura hesitated. 6 months. Maybe less. Takeda closed his eyes. 6 months. I'm sorry. It's the best I can do. Takeda opened his eyes and looked at Nakamura with an expression that was almost pitying. You're lying. Nakamura felt his stomach drop. I'm not. Yes, you are. I can see it. You've been lying from the beginning. Building trust. Pretending to care. Also, you could extract information. Takeda stood. I was a fool to believe you. To think that because you looked like me, because you spoke my language, you might actually understand. He walked to the door, then stopped. You asked me once why I wouldn't help end the war. Here's the truth, Captain, I don't want the war to end. Not this way. Not with people like you doing the work of people who will never see you as one of them. He knocked on the door. Wait, Nakamura said. Takeda turned. Nakamura stood. He felt something breaking inside him. The same thing that had broken at Camp Shelby. The same thing that had been breaking, piece by piece, since he put on the uniform. You're right, Nakamura said quietly. I was lying. Not about the review, that's real. But about the rest. About caring. About understanding. I was using you. Just like I was ordered to. Takeda said nothing. But you're wrong about one thing, Nakamura continued. I do understand. I understand exactly what you're going through. Because I've been doing the same thing you have. Trying to prove I belong. Trying to earn something that can't be earned. He looked at Takeda. And you're right. It's never enough. Takeda studied him for a long moment. Then he said, then why do you keep doing it? Nakamura didn't have an answer. The guard opened the door. Takeda left. Nakamura stood alone in the office, staring at the empty chair. He had followed orders. He had extracted information. He had done his duty. But he had lost something in the process. Something he couldn't name. Something he would never get back. December 15, 1944. Nakamura submitted his final report to Breckinridge. The report detailed everything Takeda had shared over the past 2 months. Logistics networks. Supply vulnerabilities. Patterns of movement. It was valuable intelligence. The kind that would be used to plan bombing raids, submarine attacks, operations that would disrupt Japanese supply lines and hasten the end of the war. Breckinridge read the report and smiled. Excellent work, Captain. This is exactly what we needed. Thank you, sir. Takeda's been cooperative? He was. He's not anymore. Breckinridge frowned. What happened? He asked for help. I couldn't provide it. He stopped talking. Can you re-establish rapport? Nakamura shook his head. No, sir. He knows what I was doing. The trust is gone. Breckinridge considered this. That's unfortunate. But we have what we need. Good work, Captain. He closed the folder. You'll be reassigned next month. There's a new project starting up. Translation work. You'll be briefed after the holidays. Nakamura saluted and left. He walked across the base in the cold December air. Around him, soldiers moved with purpose, preparing for a war that was entering its final phase. Nakamura thought about Takeda. About the 9 men at Camp Shelby. About all the people he had betrayed in the name of duty. He had proven his loyalty. Over and over. In every way the army asked. But loyalty built on betrayal wasn't loyalty. It was just obedience. And obedience, Nakamura now understood, had a cost that could never be repaid. 3 days later, Nakamura received word that Hiroshi Takeda's wife had died at Topaz internment camp. Takeda was not allowed to attend the funeral. Nakamura sat in his quarters and stared at the notification. He had followed orders. He had done his duty. And a woman had died alone in a camp, while her husband sat in a detention facility, separated by rules that Nakamura had helped enforce. He folded the notification and placed it in his desk drawer. He did not sleep that night. And when morning came, Captain James Nakamura understood with absolute certainty. The war he was fighting was not the war he thought it was. And the enemy was not who he had been told. Fort Meade, Maryland. March 1945. The war in Europe was ending. Captain James Nakamura read the reports from his desk at the Pacific Intelligence Section. The Allies had crossed the Rhine. Berlin was surrounded. Germany would surrender within weeks. In the Pacific, the war continued. American forces had taken Iwo Jima in February. The cost had been staggering, nearly 7,000 Americans dead, 20,000 wounded. The Japanese had fought for every inch of volcanic rock, refusing to surrender even when defeat was certain. Now the military was planning the invasion of Okinawa. And after Okinawa, the invasion of Japan itself. The estimates were grim. Hundreds of thousands of American casualties. Perhaps millions of Japanese dead. Nakamura's job was to help prevent that. To gather intelligence that would give American forces every possible advantage. To translate captured documents, interrogate prisoners, analyze enemy communications. He had been doing this work for 5 months, since his reassignment in January. He was good at it. Efficient. thorough. His reports were detailed and accurate. His commanding officers praised his work. But something had changed inside him. He went through the motions. He followed orders. He produced results. But the certainty was gone. The certainty that had carried him through his years of service, the belief that loyalty and duty were the same thing, that obedience proved belonging, had crumbled. It had crumbled at Camp Shelby, when he watched Sergeant Tanaka board a truck to a labor battalion. It had crumbled at Santa Fe, when he learned that Takeda's wife had died while her husband remained imprisoned. And it had crumbled every day since, as Nakamura continued to serve an institution that demanded everything from him and gave nothing in return. He still wore the uniform. He still saluted. He still said yes, sir. But he no longer believed. March 15, 1945. Lieutenant Colonel Breckinridge summoned Nakamura to his office. Nakamura entered and saluted. Breckinridge gestured to a chair. "Sit, Captain. We need to talk about your next assignment." Nakamura sat. Breckinridge opened a folder. "You're aware that we're planning the invasion of Okinawa?" "Yes, sir." "And you're aware that after Okinawa, we'll be preparing for the invasion of the Japanese home islands?" "Yes, sir." Breckinridge leaned forward. "That invasion, Operation Downfall, will be the largest amphibious assault in history. The casualties will be unprecedented. Our job is to minimize those casualties by gathering every piece of intelligence we can." He slid a document across the desk. "This is a new initiative. We're establishing forward interrogation teams. Small units that will accompany invasion forces and conduct field interrogations of captured Japanese soldiers immediately after combat." Nakamura scanned the document. "Real-time intelligence." "Exactly. No delays. No waiting for prisoners to be transported to rear areas. We interrogate them on the battlefield and pass actionable intelligence directly to commanders. And you want me to lead one of these teams?" "Yes. You'll have a team of 3 translators, a security detail, and full authority to conduct interrogations as you see fit. You'll deploy to Okinawa in April, and then to Japan when the invasion begins." Breckinridge smiled. "This is a significant responsibility, Captain. But you've proven yourself. You're the right man for this." Nakamura looked at the document. It was a promotion, in everything but rank. Command of a critical intelligence unit. Direct impact on combat operations. It was everything he should have wanted. "Sir," Nakamura said carefully, "what are the rules of engagement for these interrogations?" Breckinridge's smile faded slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what methods are authorized? What are the limits?" "The limits are defined by necessity, Captain. We need information quickly. Lives depend on it. You'll use whatever methods are required to get that information." "Whatever methods," Nakamura repeated. "Within reason, of course. We're not barbarians. But if a prisoner is withholding intelligence that could save American lives, you do what needs to be done." Nakamura set the document on the desk. "And if the prisoner doesn't have useful intelligence? Then you move on to the next one. And if the methods we use violate the Geneva Convention?" Breckinridge's expression hardened. "The Japanese don't follow the Geneva Convention, Captain. They torture our prisoners. They execute them. They treat surrender as dishonor. We're not going to handicap ourselves with rules the enemy ignores. So we become like them. No. We do what's necessary to win. There's a difference." Nakamura said nothing. Breckinridge studied him. "You have doubts. I have questions. Then let me answer them. This war has cost hundreds of thousands of American lives. It will cost hundreds of thousands more if we invade Japan. Your job, our job, is to reduce that cost. If that means pushing the boundaries of interrogation, then that's what we do. Because the alternative is unacceptable." He leaned back. "You've done difficult work before, Captain. At Camp Shelby. At Santa Fe, you made hard decisions. This is no different. But it was different. Nakamura knew it was different. At Camp Shelby, he had betrayed men who trusted him. At Santa Fe, he had manipulated a man who had already lost everything. But this was something else. This was sanctioned cruelty. This was violence dressed as necessity. "I need time to think about it, sir," Nakamura said. Breckinridge frowned. "There's nothing to think about, Captain. This is an order." "Then I'd like to request a transfer. To a different assignment." "Denied. You're the most qualified officer we have for this role. You speak the language. You understand the culture. You've proven you can handle difficult situations." "Sir, this isn't a discussion, Captain. You deploy to Okinawa in 3 weeks." "Dismissed." Nakamura saluted and left. He walked across the base in the cold March air, feeling the weight of the order settle over him. He had been given a choice that wasn't a choice. Obey, and become the kind of person he had spent his life trying not to be. Or refuse, and face court-martial, disgrace, the destruction of everything he had worked for. It was Camp Shelby again. It was Santa Fe again. But this time, Nakamura understood something he hadn't understood before. There was a third option. Nakamura spent the next 2 weeks preparing for deployment. He attended briefings. He reviewed intelligence reports. He met with the translators who would serve on his team, young Nisei soldiers, fresh from language school, eager to prove themselves. They looked at him with respect. With admiration. They saw a Japanese-American officer who had succeeded, who had earned command, who represented what they hoped to become. Nakamura looked at them and saw himself 3 years ago. Before Camp Shelby. Before Santa Fe. Before he understood what loyalty cost. One of the translators, a private named David Kimura, approached him after a briefing. "Captain Nakamura, sir. I just wanted to say, it's an honor to serve under you." Nakamura nodded. "Thank you, Private. My family is at Manzanar. Same as yours. When I heard you were leading this team, I requested the assignment. I figured if someone like you could make it this far, maybe there's hope for the rest of us." Kimura smiled. "We're going to prove ourselves, sir. Show them what we're capable of." Nakamura looked at the young man's earnest face and felt something break inside him. "Private," he said quietly, "can I give you some advice?" "Of course, sir. Don't try to prove anything. Just do your job. And when they ask you to do something that feels wrong, don't do it. No matter what they threaten. No matter what they promise." Kimura's smile faded. "Sir, you'll understand eventually. I hope you understand before it's too late." Nakamura walked away, leaving Kimura standing alone, confused. March 28, 1945. Nakamura sat in his quarters, staring at a letter he had written and rewritten a dozen times. The letter was addressed to Lieutenant Colonel Breckinridge. It was a resignation. Not from the army, he couldn't resign during wartime without facing charges. But a resignation from the assignment. A formal refusal to lead the interrogation team. He knew what would happen if he submitted it. Court-martial. Dishonorable discharge. Prison, possibly. His family would be shamed. His service would be erased. Everything he had worked for would be destroyed. But he also knew what would happen if he didn't submit it. He would go to Okinawa. He would interrogate prisoners. He would use whatever methods were required. He would extract information through fear, through pain, through the systematic breaking of human beings. He would become the thing he had been fighting against. Nakamura folded the letter and placed it in an envelope. He sat there for a long time, holding the envelope, feeling the weight of the decision. Then he stood, walked to Breckinridge's office, and slid the envelope under the door. He returned to his quarters and waited. The response came the next morning. A military policeman knocked on Nakamura's door at 0600 hours. "Captain Nakamura, You're to report to Colonel Breckinridge immediately." Nakamura dressed and followed the MP to the administration building. Breckinridge was waiting in his office. His expression was cold. "Sit down, Captain." Nakamura sat. Breckinridge held up the letter. "Explain this." "It's a refusal, sir. I cannot in good conscience lead the interrogation team." "Cannot, or will not?" "Both." Breckinridge set the letter down. "Do you understand what you're doing? You're refusing a direct order during wartime. That's a court-martial offense. You could be imprisoned. Dishonorably discharged." "I understand, sir." "Then why?" Nakamura took a breath. "Because I've spent 3 years following orders that I knew were wrong. I've betrayed people who trusted me. I've manipulated people who had already lost everything. I've done all of it in the name of duty, in the name of loyalty, in the name of proving I belong." He looked at Breckinridge. "And I've learned that loyalty built on betrayal isn't loyalty. It's just obedience. And I'm done being obedient." Breckinridge stared at him. "You're throwing away your career. Your future. Everything you've worked for." "I know." "For what? A principle? A feeling? For the ability to live with myself." Breckinridge leaned back in his chair. He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "You're not the first officer to refuse an assignment, Captain. And you won't be the last. But most of them have the sense to do it quietly. To request a transfer for medical reasons. To find a way out that doesn't destroy them. I'm not looking for a way out, sir. I'm refusing the order. Publicly. On the record." "Why?" "Because someone needs to." Breckinridge shook his head. "You're a fool, Captain. Maybe. You could have had a future in this army. You could have been a major. A colonel. You could have proven that Japanese Americans can lead. I don't want to prove anything anymore, sir. I just want to stop doing harm." Breckinridge stood. "You're under arrest, Captain. You'll be confined to quarters pending court-martial proceedings." Dismissed. 2 MPs entered the office. They escorted Nakamura out. As he walked across the base in handcuffs, Nakamura felt something he hadn't felt in years. Relief. April 10, 1945. Nakamura sat in a holding cell at Fort Meade, waiting for his court-martial. The cell was small. A cot, a sink, a barred window that looked out at the base. He had been there for 2 weeks. He spent his days reading. Thinking. Waiting. He had no regrets. On the morning of April 10th, a guard opened the cell door. "You have a visitor, Captain." Nakamura stood. He expected his lawyer, a young JAG officer who had been assigned to his case. But the man who entered was not his lawyer. It was Sergeant Robert Tanaka. Nakamura stared. "Tanaka?" Tanaka stood in the doorway, wearing his uniform. He looked older. Thinner. But his eyes held the same steady gaze Nakamura remembered from Camp Shelby. "Hello, Captain. What are you doing here?" "I heard about your court-martial. I came to testify." Nakamura felt his chest tighten. "Testify for the prosecution?" "No. For you." Nakamura sat down on the cot. "I don't understand." Tanaka entered the cell and sat beside him. "After you transferred me to the Labor Battalion, I spent 6 months loading trucks in Louisiana. Then the Army decided they needed more combat troops. They gave me a choice, stay in the Labor Battalion, or volunteer for the 442nd in Europe. You volunteered." "Yes. I deployed to Italy in March. I fought in the Romarno campaign. I was wounded at Bruyères. And I was there when the 442nd rescued the lost battalion." Nakamura had read about that. The 442nd had saved a surrounded Texas battalion in the Vosges Mountains. It had been one of the bloodiest battles of the war. The 442nd had suffered over 800 casualties to save 200 men. "I'm sorry," Nakamura said. "For what?" "For what I did to you. For reporting you. For getting you transferred." Tanaka was silent for a moment. Then he said, "I was angry. For a long time. I thought you had betrayed us." "I did." "No. You followed orders. There's a difference." "Is there?" Tanaka looked at him. "I used to think so. But after Bruyers, after watching men die to prove something that shouldn't need proving, I started to understand. You were trying to survive. Just like the rest of us. You were trying to prove you belonged. Just like the rest of us." He paused. "But now you're doing something different. You're refusing. You're saying no. And that takes more courage than anything I did in France." Nakamura shook his head. "I'm not courageous. I'm just tired." "Maybe. But you're also right. And someone needs to say it." Tanaka stood. "I'm going to testify at your court-martial. I'm going to tell them what happened at Camp Shelby. I'm going to tell them that you were following orders, just like they taught us to do. And I'm going to tell them that refusing an unjust order is not cowardice. It's the only kind of courage that matters." He walked to the door, then turned back. "You asked me once why I volunteered from the camps. I told you it was to prove something. But the truth is, I didn't know. I just knew I had to do something. Anything. To feel like I had control over my own life." He smiled, but there was sadness in it. "You're doing the same thing now, Captain. And for what it's worth, I respect that." Tanaka left. Nakamura sat alone in the cell, feeling something shift inside him. For 3 years, he had believed that loyalty meant obedience. That duty meant following orders, no matter the cost. But Tanaka had shown him something different. Loyalty wasn't obedience. It was the courage to refuse when obedience demanded betrayal. April 18, 1945. The court-martial took place in a small courtroom on the base. Nakamura sat at the defense table, flanked by his lawyer. Across the room, the prosecution presented its case. The charges were clear: refusal to obey a lawful order. Conduct unbecoming an officer. The evidence was undeniable. Nakamura had submitted a written refusal. He had not disputed the facts. The prosecution argued that Nakamura's refusal undermined military discipline. That it set a dangerous precedent. That it could not be tolerated, especially during wartime. Then the defense called its witnesses. Sergeant Robert Tanaka testified about Camp Shelby. About the 9 men who had been transferred. About the impossible position Nakamura had been placed in. Private David Kimura testified about the interrogation team. About the orders they had been given. About the methods they were expected to use. And then Nakamura himself took the stand. The prosecutor stood. "Captain Nakamura, do you deny that you refused a direct order?" "No." "Do you deny that you understood the consequences of that refusal?" "No." "Then why did you do it?" Nakamura looked at the prosecutor. Then at the panel of officers who would decide his fate. "Because I was ordered to do something I knew was wrong," he said quietly. "And I've spent 3 years doing things I knew were wrong. I've betrayed people who trusted me. I've manipulated people who had already lost everything. I've done all of it because I believed that loyalty meant obedience." He paused. "But I was wrong. Loyalty doesn't mean following orders without question. It means having the courage to refuse when those orders violate everything we're supposed to be fighting for." The courtroom was silent. "I don't expect you to understand," Nakamura continued. "I don't expect you to agree. But I couldn't lead that interrogation team. I couldn't become the kind of person who uses cruelty as a tool. Because if I did that, then everything I've sacrificed, everything we've all sacrificed, would mean nothing." He looked at the panel. "I'm not a traitor. I'm not a coward. "I'm just a man who finally understood that some orders should not be followed." The prosecutor had no more questions. The panel deliberated for 3 hours. When they returned, the verdict was guilty. The sentence: dishonorable discharge, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, 6 months confinement. Nakamura stood as the sentence was read. He felt no anger, no fear, only certainty. He had made the right choice. August 15, 1945. Nakamura sat in his cell at Fort Leavenworth Military Prison, reading a newspaper. The headline was simple: Japan surrenders. The war was over. Atomic bombs had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Japanese government had accepted unconditional surrender. American forces would occupy Japan. The invasion Nakamura had refused to participate in would never happen. He set the newspaper down and stared at the wall. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians had died in the atomic bombings. The cities had been destroyed in an instant. It was a horror beyond comprehension. But it was also the end. No invasion. No Operation Downfall. No interrogation teams extracting information through cruelty. Nakamura didn't know if he had made the right choice. He didn't know if his refusal had mattered. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He could live with himself. September 1945. Nakamura was released from prison after serving 4 months of his sentence. The war was over. The military was demobilizing. There was no point in keeping him confined. He left Fort Leavenworth with a dishonorable discharge, no money, and no plan. He took a train to Los Angeles. The camps were closing. Families were being released. People were returning to lives that no longer existed. Nakamura found his parents in a temporary housing facility near Little Tokyo. They had been released from Manzanar 2 weeks earlier. His mother cried when she saw him. His father said nothing, but his eyes held something Nakamura hadn't seen in years. Pride. "You did the right thing," his father said quietly. "You refused." Nakamura nodded. They didn't talk about the court-martial. They didn't talk about the war. They didn't talk about the camps. They just sat together in a small room in a temporary facility, 3 people trying to rebuild lives that had been shattered. October 1945. Nakamura found work as a translator for the occupation forces in Japan. The army needed people who spoke Japanese. People who understood the culture. They didn't care about his dishonorable discharge. They needed him. He accepted the job. Not because he wanted to serve. Not because he believed in the occupation. But because he needed to see what had been done. He arrived in Tokyo in November. The city was in ruins. Entire neighborhoods had been burned to ash. People lived in rubble. Children begged for food. Nakamura walked through the destruction and thought about Hiroshi Takeda. About Sergeant Tanaka. About the 9 men transferred from Camp Shelby. About all the people who had been sacrificed in the name of loyalty. He thought about the question Takeda had asked him: "Why do you keep doing it?" Nakamura finally had an answer. Because someone had to witness. Someone had to remember. Someone had to carry the weight of what had been done. Not to justify it. Not to excuse it. But to ensure it was never forgotten. December 1945. Nakamura stood in the ruins of Hiroshima. The city was gone. Flattened. A wasteland of ash and twisted metal. He walked through the silence, past the shadows burned into walls, past the survivors who moved like ghosts. He thought about the interrogation team he had refused to lead. About the methods he had been ordered to use. About the cruelty he had been told was necessary. And he understood, with a clarity that was almost painful. The war had not been won by loyalty. It had been won by violence. By destruction. By the willingness to do anything, no matter the cost. And men like him, men who had tried to prove their loyalty through service, through sacrifice, through obedience, had been used as tools. tools that were discarded the moment they refused to be used anymore. Nakamura stood in the ruins of Hiroshima and felt the weight of everything he had done, everything he had failed to do, settle over him. He could not change the past. He could not undo the betrayals. He could not bring back the people who had been lost. But he could carry their memory. He could refuse to forget. And he could live with the certainty that, in the end, he had chosen to stop. The silence that remained was not peace. It was not redemption. It was just silence. The silence of a man who had finally understood that loyalty, when measured by obedience, was not loyalty at all. It was just the willingness to do harm in someone else's name. And Captain James Nakamura, no longer a captain, no longer a soldier, just a man, would carry that silence for the rest of his life. Not as punishment, but as witness. To the cost of obedience. To the weight of certainty. To the moment when he finally said no.